So imagine you want to perfectly enslave a human being, right? Do you break their jaw with a steel boot? Or do you hand them a pill that makes them permanently happy? Or, do you simply move them into a high school gym and change the locks? Today, we are opening the blueprints of the three most famous architectural cages in literary history. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
It is a really profound and, frankly, terrifying framing for a conversation. Because when we talk about cages, we usually look for the iron bars,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
We want the threat to be visible so we can categorize it. But today, we are stepping into a landscape of control that is just completely shape-shifting.
And we have a massive stack of source material sitting right in front of us to help map that landscape.
Yeah.
We're talking about three absolute masterworks of dystopian fiction: George Orwell's 1984, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale.
Three heavy hitters.
Oh, absolutely. Now, our mission for you, the listener, is to unpack these texts side by side. Because while all three of these books are fundamentally about totalitarian societies, their methods of maintaining absolute control are completely divergent. They represent three entirely different philosophies of power.
Right. And to be clear about our methodology today, we are not going to sit here and simply recount the plots for you.
Nobody wants a book report.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are approaching these texts as, well, basically structural engineers. We're going to unroll the blueprints of these three distinct regimes and examine the load-bearing walls of their societies.
I love that analogy.
Thanks. We need to ask, how do they manipulate the physical environment? How do they rewire language? How do they regulate human intimacy? And ultimately, how do they manage the explosive force of human emotion to achieve an unbroken dominance over the individual?
So whether you are prepping for a high-level literature seminar or you're just, wildly curious about the underlying mechanics of how power actually operates on the human psyche, this deep dive is going to give you a completely new lens through which to view these classic texts.
We're really going to break down the specific how and the terrifying why of tyranny.
Yeah, and just a quick note before we jump into the texts. These sources deal with extreme political, societal, and often deeply disturbing structural violence. As always, our goal here is not to take a political side or weigh in on modern partisan debates. We're here to impartially explore the brilliant, deeply complex ideas contained in the author's original texts. We are analyzing the mechanics of control, not endorsing them.
That is a crucial distinction. We have to look at the machinery of these societies objectively if we want to understand how they function.
Right.
And to understand how they function, we have to start with the foundational layer of any society, which is the physical space.
Yep.
Before a regime can even hope to control the human mind, it must control the environment the body occupies.
That makes perfect sense. The space around a citizen completely dictates their daily reality. So let's begin by looking at the physical cages these authors built, maybe starting with Orwell.
Let's do.
The physical world of 1984 is just an aggressive assault on the senses. The very first page doesn't just introduce you to Winston Smith, it introduces you to a state of perpetual sensory decay.
Oh, the cabbage smell.
Yes! The clocks are striking 13. Winston is trying to escape this vile, biting wind. The hallway of his apartment building, Victory Mansion, smells of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. There is a swirl of gritty dust that seems to coat absolutely everything.
The physical environment is engineered to be aggressively miserable. Orwell is meticulously establishing a world of chronic deprivation.
It's so bleak.
It is. The
Yeah.
19th century houses are rotting, they're shored up with timber, their windows patched with cardboard, roofs patched with corrugated iron. It's a world where absolutely nothing works as it should, nothing is aesthetically beautiful, and nothing provides even a baseline of physical comfort.
I found the details of the inefficiency so striking, honestly. Like, the elevator in Winston's building is broken, ostensibly because the electric current is cut off during daylight hours for the quote-unquote economy drive leading up to Hate Week.
Right, the perpetual state of emergency.
Exactly. And when Winston drinks his victory gin, the text describes it smelling like oily Chinese rice spirit. It hits him like a dose of nitric acid, literally making his eyes water. But here is the architectural paradox that Orwell introduces, which I really want to unpack.
Okay, what is it?
You have this gritty, crumbling, cabbage-scented decay on the ground level, but then Winston looks out the window and we see the architecture of the state.
The ministries.
Right. The four ministries: the Ministry of Truth, the Ministry of Peace, the Ministry of Love, and the Ministry of Plenty. These are not just bureaucratic office buildings. Orwell describes them as enormous, gleaming, white concrete pyramids soaring 300 meters into the air. They completely dwarf the squalor of the city below them.
They're designed to be overwhelming.
But okay, let's unpack this. I struggle with the logic of the party's architectural choices here. The names of these buildings are wild contradictions of their actual functions. Take the Ministry of Love.
The most terrifying one.
Yeah. The text describes it as having absolutely no windows. It is an impenetrable fortress surrounded by a maze of barbed wire entanglements, steel doors, and hidden machine gun nests guarded by gorilla-faced men in black uniforms.
A literal fortress.
It's the place where dissidents are tortured. Why not just project total terror? It's like calling a slaughterhouse a wellness center. Why the blatant contradiction? Why name your windowless torture fortress the Ministry of Love? It feels like an unnecessary irony for a regime that already has absolute power.
Well, it isn't just irony, right? It is a profound psychological mechanism. That contradiction is the physical manifestation of Orwell's concept of doublethink.
Doublethink. Okay, explain how that works with the building.
The regime doesn't just want to oppress you physically, it wants to break your cognitive ability to even recognize the oppression. By calling a heavily fortified slaughterhouse the Ministry of Love, they are forcing the citizen's mind to hold two entirely contradictory beliefs simultaneously.
That it's a place of terror and a place of love.
Exactly, and to accept both of them as absolute truth.
Wow. So the architecture itself is a tool for cognitive dissonance. The state demands that you look at a windowless barbed wire bunker and genuinely feel that it represents love. If you can make a citizen do that, I guess you've severed their connection to objective reality completely.
Precisely. It destroys their reliance on their own senses. And physically, the state needs the everyday world of the citizens to be as bleak, gray, and crumbling as possible.
Because of the contrast.
Exactly. The contrast is where the power lies. The only things in Winston's world that have vibrant color, structural integrity, and undeniable power are the massive pyramids of the ministries and the omnipresent, colorful posters of Big Brother.
Oh, right. Big Brother's always watching you.
Yeah. The physical environment is an intentional binary. The individual is infinitesimally small and rotting, while the party is eternal, towering, and gleaming.
Okay, so Orwell proves that oppressing a population with dust, physical misery, and towering, terrifying monuments takes a massive amount of violent, oppressive energy. At some point, an architect of tyranny has to look at that system and ask, isn't it economically cheaper and practically easier to just engineer a human who actually likes the cage?
That is the exact philosophical pivot that brings us to Aldous Huxley.
A completely different vibe.
Totally. If Orwell's environment is designed to crush the human spirit through decay and terror, Huxley's physical environment in Brave New World is designed to manufacture the human spirit from scratch on an assembly line.
The contrast is so jarring. We leave the dust and cabbage of London in 1984, and we enter the London of the world state. The physical environment here isn't a towering pyramid. It's a squat gray building of only 34 stories.
The Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Center.
Right. And the motto over the door isn't about war or Big Brother. It's community, identity, stability. And inside, there is no dirt. There is cold, harsh, controlled light. There are test tubes, microscopes, yellow barrels, and workers in white overalls. It's a sterile laboratory.
Huxley's cage is entirely clinical. When the director of hatcheries is leading a group of students through the facility in the opening chapter, he doesn't show them torture devices. He shows them the Volkanovsky process.
And we really need to look at the biological mechanics Huxley describes here because they form the foundation of this society's control. I actually want to dig deep into that because the book presents it almost like a triumphant scientific lecture.
It does. It reads like a proud tour guide.
Right. The director explains that a normal human egg yields one normal human being. But a Volkanovskified egg will bud, proliferate, and divide. What is the actual mechanism the state is using to achieve this?
Well, the text details a highly specific, pseudoscientific process of deliberate trauma. The hatchery workers take a fertilized egg and subject it to X-rays. Yeah, radiation. This radiation arrests its growth, but instead of dying, the egg responds to the trauma by budding. Then they chill the egg to further arrest its growth, causing it to bud again.
So they're literally torturing the cells.
Exactly. And finally, they dose it with alcohol. By subjecting the biological material to these highly controlled microdoses of physical trauma, a single egg can divide and create up to 96 identical twins.
Standard men and women in uniform batches. That phrase from the book is just chilling to me. The state is using literal radiation and poison X-rays and alcohol, not to punish a living citizen, but to biologically stunt a human before it is even fully formed.
Right. Ensuring it never develops the capacity for individuality.
Exactly.
And that is the crucial insight here. In Orwell's world, the state waits for you to become a person and then uses the ministry of love to break you back down into a compliant piece of matter. In Huxley's world, the state intervenes at the cellular level.
Before you even have a brain to break.
Yes. The physical space reflects this philosophy perfectly. There's no unpredictable nature, there's no dirt, there are no mothers or fathers. Everything is calculated, sterilized, and perfectly calibrated. You do not need a 300-meter-high pyramid to intimidate a population if you have already perfectly engineered their biology to be submissive while they are still in a test tube.
The word they use in the text isn't born. The citizens are decanted.
Decanted, yeah.
It treats human life like pouring wine from a vat.
Yeah. But there is an even more insidious architectural trick waiting for us. Huxley builds a futuristic, sterile lab. Orwell builds an impossibly massive, brutalist pyramid. But Margaret Atwood, in The Handmaid's Tale, doesn't invent new futuristic architecture at all.
Yeah, she does.
She just repurposes your local grocery store.
Yeah.
And somehow, that might be the most terrifying architectural choice of all three. Here's where it gets really interesting.
It's the weaponization of the familiar. Atwood grounds the horror of Gilead not in alien technology, but in the domestic spaces we all take for granted. Let's look closely at the room where the main character, Offred, is kept. She is a prisoner of the state, forced into reproductive servitude, but she isn't in a windowless dungeon. She describes sitting at a desk. But it's not a newly manufactured piece of state furniture. It is a former school desk.
A regular school desk.
Yeah, it's blonde wood, and on the top of the desk she can see initials carved into it. J.H. Loves BP 1954. She sits in a room with a braided rug, a window with white curtains, a picture of flowers.
It's so mundane.
Right. And when the handmaids are sent to be trained at the Red Center, they are placed in an old high school gymnasium. The text notes that you can still smell the sweat of teenage basketball games. You can still see the painted lines on the floor where they used to play volleyball.
So the academic term for this architectural layering, and it's a crucial concept for understanding Atwood's specific brand of dystopia, is a palimpsest.
A palimpsest. Okay, define that for me.
Historically, a palimpsest is a piece of parchment or manuscript where the original writing has been scraped off so the valuable paper can be written over again.
Oh, to reuse it.
Exactly. But the scraping is never perfect. You can always see the faint, ghostly traces of the original text underneath the new ink.
That reframes exactly how I view the setting of this book. Gilead is a societal palimpsest. It is built directly on top of our world. The terror doesn't come from the unfamiliar. It comes from taking the utterly mundane, a high school gym, a suburban bedroom, and imposing a brutal totalitarian framework over it.
And that familiar setting creates a relentless, agonizing psychological friction for the characters. I mean, think about the temporal differences between our three protagonists.
Okay.
Winston Smith in 1984 was a child when the revolution happened. His memories of the world before the party are fragmentary and unreliable. The citizens of Brave New World were decanted into their system. They literally never knew any other way of existing.
Right.
But Offred is a woman of our time. She remembers everything.
Every carved initial on that desk, every lingering smell of sweat in the gymnasium is a brutal sensory reminder of the autonomy and freedom that was violently taken from her. The physical architecture of Gilead is designed, whether intentionally or just by the nature of a sudden coup, to taunt its prisoners with the ghosts of their past lives.
It operates on a principle of psychological dislocation. For the listener, imagine walking down the street in your own neighborhood. The physical layout is exactly the same. The sidewalks, the brick buildings, the corner store. But suddenly the signs at the grocery store don't have words on them anymore. They just have pictures of meat or pictures of fruit.
Because women are no longer legally allowed to read.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The physical environment is exactly the same, but the laws of physics governing social interaction within that environment have been completely violently rewritten. The familiarity of the cage is what makes the imprisonment so psychologically devastating.
Wow. So we have the crushing sensory decay of Orwell, the sterile cellular manufacturing line of Huxley, and the weaponized, overwritten familiarity of Atwood.
Building the cage is just phase one.
Right. Once a regime has successfully constructed this physical cage, whatever form it takes, the immediate next step is making sure the prisoner doesn't try to find a way out. And you cannot prevent escape just by locking the door, right? You have to dismantle the prisoner's inner life. You have to break the mind. Let's look at how these three systems eradicate the individual.
In 1984, the primary tool for dismantling the inner life, aside from the overt physical torture, which we'll discuss later, is the systemic manipulation of language. The party is in the process of developing a completely new language called Newspeak.
The linguistic engineering in this book is fascinating. I want to bring up the character of Syme, who is a philologist and an expert on the Newspeak dictionary. Winston is having lunch with him, and Syme is talking about his work with this terrifying, genuine enthusiasm. He says, quote, "It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words."
And we have to look at how that destruction operates. The goal of Newspeak isn't just to censor what people say. Censorship is a reactive measure.
Right, wait until they speak, then punish them.
Exactly. But the party wants to be proactive. The ultimate goal of Newspeak is to make a dissenting thought, a thought crime, literally impossible to formulate in the brain, because the actual words required to construct that concept no longer exist.
The source text provides an incredible, deeply unsettling example of how this works mechanically. The book explains that in Newspeak, the sentence, "all mans are equal," is perfectly grammatically correct. You can say it.
But the meaning has changed.
Completely. The meaning of the word equal has been surgically altered. In Newspeak, equal can only refer to physical dimensions, like saying two men are of equal height or equal weight. The entire concept of political or social equality has been completely purged from the language.
It is a process of shrinking the universe of thought. The party operates on the philosophical premise that reality exists entirely within the human mind. Therefore, if you control the boundaries of language, you control the boundaries of consciousness itself.
That is just mind-blowing.
By cutting the language down to the bone, you remove the nuance required for individual philosophical inquiry. I mean, if you don't have a word for freedom, or if the word free only means without, as in the dog is free from lice, how can you possibly conceptualize the abstract political desire to be a free human being?
You literally lack the cognitive building blocks, which makes Winston's early actions in the novel so incredibly profound. He buys a diary. And it's not just the act of keeping a secret, it's the physical object itself. Orwell describes it as a thick, quarter-sized blank book with smooth, creamy paper. It's an antique.
A relic from before the revolution.
Yeah. And Winston uses a real pen with a real nib, dipping it into a bottle of ink. Just the physical act of dipping a wet pen onto beautiful, porous paper is a massive sensory act of rebellion against the stark utilitarianism of the party.
Because keeping a diary is the ultimate assertion of the individual ego. It requires an internal narrative. It requires an independent observer who is actively recording and evaluating reality, independent of the state's official narrative.
When he sits in that little alcove in his apartment, just out of sight of the telescreen, and writes down with Big Brother over and over again, he is fully aware he has committed a crime punishable by death. The mere act of unregulated private expression is the ultimate threat to a regime that demands total linguistic conformity.
But once again, we have to look at the causal bridge between Orwell's methodology and Huxley's. Maintaining the thought police, monitoring every telescreen, and hunting down every hidden diary requires immense logistical effort.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly expensive.
If you do not have the resources to police every pen and piece of paper, you need a population that never wants to write in the first place.
Right. But what if you don't need a thought police? What if you don't need to arrest people for thought crime because you have successfully programmed their thoughts before they even know how to speak? This brings us to the core psychological mechanism of Brave New World: hypnopedia or sleep teaching.
In The Hatchery, the director proudly refers to hypnopedia as the greatest moralizing and socializing force of all time. It is the process by which the world state conditions the minds of its citizens, not through fear, but through relentless, inescapable auditory repetition.
I think we need to look at the specific mechanics of this because it isn't just generic brainwashing. Huxley is very specific about how it works. While the children are sleeping in their dormitories, small speakers placed under their pillows softly whisper phrases into their ears thousands and thousands of times.
The drip, drip, drip of programming.
Exactly. The text gives us the exact phrases. A beta child, while sleeping, hears a voice murmuring, "Alpha children wear gray." They work much harder than we do because they're so frightfully clever. I'm really awfully glad I'm a beta because I don't work so hard. And we are much better than the gammas and deltas.
It is a brilliant, terrifying system of social stratification embedded directly into the subconscious. They are conditioned from infancy to accept their exact caste, whether they are an intellectual alpha, a managerial beta, or a semi-moronic epsilon bred for manual labor, without a single moment of existential doubt.
I just accept it.
They are programmed to inherently love the specific job they will do, to prefer the specific clothes they will wear, and to automatically reject the lifestyles of the other castes.
You know, I often hear people compare Hypnopedia to modern algorithmic feeds that quietly shape our preferences while we sort of sleepwalk through our phones. And I used to use the metaphor that it's like a warm blanket of conditioning. But looking closer at the text, that metaphor isn't quite right.
What would you say is a better metaphor?
It's not a warm blanket, it's a slow drip IV of psychological anesthesia. It doesn't heal the existential wound of being enslaved. It just numbs the nerve endings so completely that you don't even feel the scalpel when the state cuts away your individuality.
That is a much more accurate assessment of Huxley's mechanism. The mind in Brave New World isn't broken by terror, it is molded by saturation. It's a constant soothing stream of suggestions that entirely bypass the critical faculties of the waking brain.
And it raises a massive debate, which I want to pose to you. Is Huxley's method actually more insidious than Orwell's? Because with Orwell's boot on your face, you know you are being oppressed. Winston knows he hates the party. But in Huxley's world, the conditioning is invisible. It feels like a warm blanket. You are enslaved. Your destiny was written in a test tube and whispered into your sleeping ear, but you are smiling.
This is the fundamental divergence in dystopian theory. Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us, that pain and fear will be used to control us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. He recognized that you do not need to ban books if you have conditioned a population that simply has no desire to read one.
That's a terrifying thought.
You eradicate the individual by fulfilling their artificially engineered desires so perfectly that they never ask a dangerous question.
Which provides a stark transition to Atwood's method of breaking the mind. If Orwell uses linguistic starvation to shrink reality, and Huxley uses psychological saturation to numb the mind, Gilead uses biological reduction.
Stripping away the self.
Yes. They strip away your identity by forcibly reducing you entirely to your physical, bodily utility.
In The Handmaid's Tale, the eradication of the individual is profoundly tied to gender and reproduction.
Well,
Women in Gilead are no longer individuals with personal histories, careers, bank accounts, or complex personalities. They are defined, legally and socially, entirely by their reproductive viability.
the language the text uses to describe the handmaids is incredibly dehumanizing. They are referred to as two-legged wombs, ambulatory chalices, and sacred vessels. The regime operates on the premise that the person wrapped around the womb is entirely irrelevant, only the biological function matters.
And we see this psychological stripping executed methodically in the daily lives of the characters. It isn't just about the grand laws, it is about the microaggressions of control.
The detail about the hand lotion always sticks with me. The handmaids are denied the smallest, most basic comforts of bodily autonomy and individuality. They aren't allowed to have face cream or hand lotion.
No, it's considered vanity.
Right. The regime deems it an unnecessary luxury for a vessel. So the text describes Offred and the other handmaids hoarding small pats of butter from their meals. They hide it, take it to their rooms, and rub the butter on their faces and hands to keep their skin from cracking.
I want to look at the mechanism behind that specific detail. Why butter? What does that matter? Butter is a symbol of domestic nourishment.
Oh, that's interesting.
By rubbing it on their skin, the handmaids are quietly subverting the very domestic subservience that Gilead forces upon them. They are desperately trying to maintain their own biological boundaries, to care for the outer shell of their identity, even when the state insists that only their internal organs have value.
It's a heartbreaking, tiny act of reclamation. But the state counters these small acts with overwhelming systemic erasure, the most violent of which is the removal of their names.
The patronymic naming system.
Offred.
Of Glynn. Of Warren.
Right. Offred isn't a name, it's a prepositional phrase indicating ownership. She is a Fred. She is the property of the commander named Fred. When she is reassigned to a new commander, her name will change to reflect her new owner.
Complete erasure.
Yeah. Her entire past identity, her real name, which we are never definitively given in the text, is erased and replaced by a label that denotes her current placement in the supply chain of reproduction.
And the architect of this psychological conditioning is the character of Aunt Lydia, who runs the Red Center where the handmaids are indoctrinated. Aunt Lydia's philosophy is central to understanding how Gilead breaks the female mind.
She is terrifying.
She really is. She tells the women, modesty is invisibility. She explicitly states, "To be seen is to be penetrated. What you must be, girls, is impenetrable."
That quote is so dense. What does she mean by impenetrable? She isn't talking about physical protection, is she?
No, she is talking about psychological erasure. Aunt Lydia's goal is to make the women internalize their own objectification. She is teaching them that their individuality, their desire to be seen and recognized as human beings, is actually a danger to them.
So they have to hide.
They are taught to keep their heads down, to look only at the sidewalk, to wear the white wings around their faces that blind them to the periphery and hide them from the world. The conditioning is designed to make them complicit in their own erasure, to become completely socially invisible, so they can perfectly, frictionlessly fulfill their function as biological objects.
So we have explored how these regimes construct the physical cage and how they dismantle the individual mind through language, sleep conditioning, and biological reduction. But if you successfully break the mind, there is still one massive, volatile, biological hurdle that every regime must overcome. Exactly. Human beings are deeply evolutionarily wired to seek out connection. We are driven toward intimacy, romantic love, sexual desire, and family bonds. These are incredibly powerful, inherently destabilizing forces because they create loyalties that exist outside of the state's control. So how do these architects of tyranny handle the messy reality of human sexuality and connection?
Well, they recognize that you cannot simply ignore these biological imperatives. Instead, you have to engineer them. You take the deepest human drives and you weaponize them to serve the machinery of the state.
Let's start with Orwell's approach in 1984, which is absolute puritanical suppression. The party's stance on sex is deeply disturbing. They have an organization called the Junior Anti-Sex League, whose members wear scarlet sashes around their waists, an aggressive symbol of chastity.
Right.
The party officially views sexual intercourse, and I quote from the text here, as a slightly disgusting minor operation like having an enema.
They were actively trying to kill the sex instinct. And if they cannot biologically eradicate it, they want to psychologically dirty it. They want to associate physical intimacy with shame and disgust.
Like with Winston's wife.
Look at Winston's memory of his estranged wife, Catherine. He recalls that she referred to having sex as our duty to the party. She would force herself to endure it once a week, rigidly, coldly, purely for the purpose of procreation. It was completely devoid of pleasure, romance, or human connection.
But there is a very specific structural utility to this suppression, and it's actually Julia Winston's rebellious lover who understands the mechanics of it perfectly. She isn't an intellectual, but she possesses a profound, intuitive understanding of the body.
Yes, Julia's theory of sexual repression is one of the most brilliant insights in the novel. She explains to Winston that when you repress the sex instinct, that energy doesn't just evaporate, it builds up inside the nervous system. It turns into a hysterical, neurotic, frantic energy.
And the party knows exactly how to harness that pent-up biological energy. They take sexual frustration and they channel it directly into political fanaticism. They turn it into war fever, into the screaming frenzy of the 2 minutes hate, into absolute manic worship of Big Brother.
Yeah, it's all connected.
It's like turning off the pressure valve on a massive steam engine. The steam doesn't disappear, it just routes all that explosive force directly into the pistons that drive the state's machinery.
That is a highly accurate analogy for Orwell's mechanism. The party starves the citizen of interpersonal intimacy so that the citizen is forced to redirect all of their passionate emotional energy upward toward the state. Furthermore, the party goes a step further by actively destroying the family unit.
Oh, the family structure is completely warped.
The family is traditionally a safe harbor, a locus of loyalty that exists independently of the government.
The party turns the family into a domestic surveillance network. The children are enrolled in the spies. They are systematically taught to monitor their parents, to listen at the keyholes, to report any unorthodox behavior or sleep-talking. The text gives the horrifying example of Mr. Parsons, who is turned into the thought police by his own 7-year-old daughter because he muttered down with Big Brother in his sleep.
And the terrifying part is that Parsons is actually proud of her for doing it.
Which is just so twisted.
The party destroys the deepest, most primal bond of trust that exists between humans, the bond between parent and child. By making every family member a potential informant, they ensure that true intimacy is impossible, leaving the citizen completely isolated, with Big Brother as their only safe emotional connection.
Now contrast that absolute puritanical repression with Huxley's Brave New World. Once again, Huxley looks at the problem and takes the exact opposite approach. If Orwell's logic is that repressed energy causes useful fanaticism, Huxley asks, what does oversaturated energy cause? stasis. Instead of chastity, the world state mandates absolute mandatory promiscuity.
The fundamental social axiom of the world state is everyone belongs to everyone else. Any form of exclusive romantic relationship is viewed as deeply antisocial and psychologically dangerous.
We see this clearly in the interaction between Lenina Crown and her friend Fanny. Lenina is lightly scolded by Fanny because Lenina has been dating the same man, Henry Foster, exclusively for 4 months.
4 months is way too long for that.
Fanny is genuinely concerned for her social standing. She tells Lenina it's unseemly to be so exclusive, that she ought to be a little more promiscuous to play the field. And Lenina wears a Malthusian belt, which is described almost like a fashionable cartridge belt, but instead of bullets, it's full of contraceptives. Reproduction has been entirely scientifically separated from the act of sex.
Is the reduction of intimacy to mandatory casual recreation.
Hmm.
But we have to look at the structural logic behind this, which is laid out by Mustafa Mon, one of the 10 world controllers. Mon argues that strong emotions, the kind generated by exclusive romantic love, by family bonds, by monogamy, are inherently destabilizing.
He argues that love causes pain. He says, what with mothers and lovers? What with the temptations and the lonely remorses? How could they be stable?
Stability is the ultimate god in Brave New World. By making sex a meaningless, casually available, constantly encouraged bodily function, the state effectively eliminates all the emotional peaks and valleys of the human experience.
No drama.
Exactly. If you can have physical intimacy with anyone you want, whenever you want it, with zero social friction or reproductive consequence, you never experience the agony of rejection, you never experience the madness of jealousy, and you never experience the all-consuming fire of passionate, exclusive love.
You remain emotionally flatline, and an emotionally flatline population will never start a revolution. They have completely neutralized human connection not by starving it, but by oversaturating it until it loses all meaning. Which brings us back to Atwood. If Orwell weaponizes chastity and Huxley weaponizes promiscuity, Gilead weaponizes state-sanctioned breeding. And I use the word weaponizes deliberately because intimacy in The Handmaid's Tale is a tool of subjugation.
We must examine the ceremony. It is arguably one of the most chilling, uncomfortable scenes in modern literature because of how clinically it reduces the reproductive act.
I found the mechanics of the scene deeply confusing and horrifying on my first read. It's framed by the regime as a deeply religious imperative, a sacred duty based on the biblical story of Rachel and her handmaid Bilhah. But the actual execution of the ceremony feels so clinical, almost like a bureaucratic audit of the female body. Help me understand the architecture of this specific room.
So the scene takes place in the commander's bedroom, which is the domain of his wife, Serena Joy. Serena Joy lies on the bed. Offred, the handmaid, lies on her back between Serena Joy's legs, her head resting on Serena Joy's stomach.
Wow.
The two women are required to hold hands, physically linking them to simulate that the wife is the one receiving the seed. The commander comes into the room, fully clothed in his uniform, and has intercourse with Offred.
It is entirely devoid of passion, romance, or even basic human acknowledgement. Offred observes the commander during the act, and she notes that he is simply doing his duty. She says, "This is not recreation, even for the commander. This is serious business. The commander, too, is doing his duty."
It is control through absolute, rigid ritual. The regime has taken the most intimate human act and turned it into a public, scheduled, hierarchical duty performed strictly under the supervision and literal physical presence of the wife. It is designed to strip any possibility of desire or emotional connection from the act of procreation.
But this is where Atwood's genius really shines, because she doesn't just show us the rigid rules of the state. She shows us the hypocrisy of the architects who built the state, because the elite, the men who wrote these puritanical laws, don't actually follow them.
The introduction of the secret club, Jezebels, completely shatters the illusion of Gilead's pious foundation.
Exactly. The commander smuggles Offred out of the house, gives her an old sequin dress and makeup from the time before, and takes her to an underground club in the city. And the club is filled with high-ranking commanders, foreign diplomats, and women who have been forced into sex work.
And the horrifying detail is that many of these women are former professionals, lawyers, sociologists, businesswomen, who were deemed unassimilable by the regime, but were physically attractive enough to be repurposed for the elite's entertainment.
I want to focus on the commander's justification for this place. When Offred asks him why a regime built on such extreme biblical puritanism allows a state-sanctioned brothel to exist, his answer reveals the entire structural truth of Gilead. He says, "Nature demands variety. for men.
The ultimate double standard.
That line is infuriating. He is using the concept of nature to justify a totalitarian, puritanical state that strips women of all basic human rights, claiming it's the natural divine order. And then in the very next breath, he turns around and uses nature again to justify his own flagrant cheating on that exact same state's rules.
That is the brilliant insight Atwood provides into the true nature of tyranny. The architects of a regime, the people at the very top of the pyramid, almost always build escape hatches for themselves. They impose rigid, suffocating morality and austerity on the populace to maintain control, but they recognize that human desire cannot be entirely extinguished.
Rules for thee, but not for me.
Precisely. So they create a hypocritical release valve exclusively for the powerful. Jezebel's proves that Gilead isn't truly about religious piety or saving the human race. It is purely about men seizing power and controlling women.
And speaking of release valves, that conceptual bridge leads us perfectly into our next section. Because even the most perfectly controlled human being, whether they are starved of emotion by the party, saturated with synthetic pleasure by the world state, or suffocated by the rituals of Gilead, will eventually boil over. The human psyche generates pressure, it generates frustration, anger, and anxiety. And all three of these authors understood that a regime cannot survive if it doesn't provide a way to manage that human rage safely.
They need a psychological pressure relief valve.
Exactly.
In 1984, that pressure valve is highly ritualized and deeply violent. It is the 2 minutes hate. We touched on this earlier when discussing sexual repression, but we need to look closely at the sensory mechanics of the ritual itself.
Every single day, all party members are required to gather in front of the massive telescreens. The programming begins, and the face of Emmanuel Goldstein, the enemy of the people, flashes into the screen. He is depicted as a traitor, the saboteur, the leader of the shadowy mythical brotherhood. And the reaction of the crowd is instantaneous and completely visceral.
Orwell describes the audio of the broadcast as a hideous, grinding speech mixed with the bleating of sheep. It is designed to grate on the nervous system.
The physical description of the crowd is terrifying. People start leaping up and down in their seats, shouting at the top of their voices to drown out the maddening, bleating voice of Goldstein. The dark-haired girl sitting near Winston gets so worked up that she picks up a heavy Newspeak dictionary and violently hurls it at the screen.
Pure frenzy.
Winston himself finds that he is shouting with the others, uncontrollably kicking his heel against the rung of his chair. He describes the feeling as a hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness, a desire to kill, to torture, to smash faces in with a sledgehammer.
We must break down the psychology of that moment.
Yeah.
Winston realizes something crucial during the hate. The rage the crowd feels is entirely abstract and undirected. It's an ambient fury. He notes that he can switch his hatred from Goldstein to the dark-haired girl to Big Brother and back again, like the flame of a blow lamp swinging from one object to another.
The party creates utterly miserable living conditions, the terrible food, the freezing apartments, the constant low-level terror of the thought police. That misery generates organic, justifiable anger in the citizens. What the party does brilliantly and terrifyingly is take that organic anger and redirect it toward a fabricated external enemy. It's a psychological lightning rod.
Precisely. Instead of the citizens realizing they are angry at the party for starving them, they are conditioned to be furious at Goldstein for supposedly sabotaging the food supply. It turns the citizen into a screaming lunatic for exactly 120 seconds. But the true mastery of the ritual happens at the very end.
When the face of Goldstein melts away and the calm, powerful face of Big Brother fills the screen.
Yes. After purging all their rage and terror, Big Brother appears as the savior. That shared release of fear and violent emotion bonds the citizens closer to the state. They view their oppressor as their protector from the very terror the oppressor manufactured.
Orwell vents the pressure through engineered collective hatred. Huxley, true to form, takes the chemical route in Brave New World. In his society, negative emotions aren't vented through screaming, they are cured pharmacologically. Enter soma.
A gram is better than a dam. The ultimate pharmaceutical solution to the human condition.
It is the perfect designer drug. It provides euphoria, pleasant hallucinations, and a complete holiday from reality. And it does so without any physical hangover or withdrawal. If a citizen feels even a hint of sadness, jealousy, frustration, or existential dread, they simply swallow a few tablets of soma, and the negative emotion is obliterated.
But Huxley recognized a deeper biological truth about the human animal. The human body is evolutionarily designed to experience stress. The adrenal glands exist for a biological reason. Even in a perfectly stable, soma-drenched society where no one is ever in danger, the physical body occasionally craves the physiological sensation of fight or flight.
You can't just delete a biological urge.
Right. If you suppress that biological urge completely, it might manifest as erratic behavior or societal instability.
So the world state provides a solution that is simultaneously brilliant and grotesque, the violent passion surrogate, or VPS.
Mustafa Mond explains the mechanism. Once a month, every citizen is required to go to a clinic and have their system flooded with adrenaline.
It is the complete physiological equivalent of fear and rage. Mon says it gives them all the tonic effects of murdering someone or being murdered, but without any actual danger or societal inconvenience. It's wild to me. Why give them adrenaline if they are already sedated?
Because the body demands it. They administer the physiological symptoms of fear like a vaccine. They give the muscular and nervous systems the chemical sensation of passion and terror so that the conscious mind never has to actually care about anything real. It is a controlled biological purge that keeps the citizen perfectly docile.
It is horrifyingly efficient.
Yeah.
But let's look at Atwood's release valve in The Handmaid's Tale. If Orwell uses a digital screen to project hate and Huxley uses a syringe to simulate it, Atwood brings the violence into the physical, tactile world. It's the participation.
A portmanteau of participation and execution. And it is arguably the most visceral mechanism of control in any of these texts.
The scene takes place immediately after a salvaging, which is essentially a public hanging. The handmaids are gathered together in a tight circle. Aunt Lydia stands before them and announces that a man has been convicted of a crime. She usually claims the crime is rape, particularly of a pregnant woman, though the text implies the truth of the charge is entirely irrelevant.
Just an excuse for violence.
Right. The man is dragged out, visibly beaten, drugged, and then Aunt Lydia blows a whistle and tells the handmaids that they may now form a circle.
What follows is an outbreak of primal, state-sanctioned mob violence. The handmaids' women, who are normally kept under the most rigid, suffocating behavioral constraints imaginable, women who aren't even allowed to speak freely or look up at the sky, are suddenly permitted and actively encouraged to physically tear this man apart with their bare hands.
The source text includes the historical notes at the very end of the book, which provides an academic, retrospective analysis of Gilead's methods. Professor Peixoto discusses the Limpkin material, noting that it was likely Commander Judd who devised the participation. And Peixoto coldly explains the systemic logic of the event. He says it acts as a steam valve for the female elements.
It is a dark, psychological masterstroke by the regime's architects. Take these women whose bodily autonomy has been entirely stolen, who are treated as livestock, and who are harboring immense amounts of repressed rage against the patriarchal system that controls them. You cannot let that rage fester, or they will rebel.
They need an outlet.
Exactly. So you give them a scapegoat. You allow them one moment of absolute, unrestrained power and physical violence.
It turns their victimhood into a sudden burst of complicit power. For 5 minutes, they aren't the prey, they are the predators. But the true horror is the aftermath. Once they have blood on their literal hands, they are psychologically bound to the regime. They have participated in the system's brutality. It drains their capacity for righteous rebellion because they have become the murderers.
I think we need to pause here and look at how this applies structurally to human behavior. The mechanisms of directing crowd anger are not confined to fiction.
Exactly. I want you, the listener, to pause and reflect on this for a second. Think about how modern society vents its collective outrage. When we see massive social media pile-ons, when thousands of people direct their collective fury at a single person who broke a social rule or committed a perceived wrong, are we looking at a decentralized digital version of the 2 minutes hate? Or a virtual participation? The architecture of shared, directed outrage is incredibly powerful, and it is uncomfortably relevant to how we interact today.
We like to believe we are highly evolved individuals immune to groupthink. But the primal urge to join the mob, to vent our own anxieties on a designated scapegoat, is a deeply ingrained human vulnerability. These authors just scaled it up to state policy.
So we have explored the architecture. We have seen how they build the physical cage, how they dismantle the mind, how they weaponize human intimacy, and how they safely vent the pressure of rage. Now, we have arrived at the climax of our deep dive. We have to ask the final and most terrifying question of all. Why?
What is the ultimate goal of these dystopias?
Yeah.
What is the core philosophy of power driving the architects who built these cages?
Let's go deep into the bowels of the Ministry of Love in 1984. Winston Smith has been caught, he has been starved, beaten, and broken. He is lying on a table talking to O'Brien, his torturer, and a high-ranking member of the inner party. And Winston, despite his pain, still holds on to a rational understanding of politics. He asks O'Brien the ultimate question: why does the party want power?
Winston assumes the party has some twisted but ultimately benevolent ideological goal. He tells O'Brien that he thinks the party is ruling for the good of the majority. Winston assumes the party believes that human beings are weak, cowardly creatures who aren't fit to govern themselves, and therefore the party took power to protect humanity from itself to eventually create a utopia.
It's the classic justification for dictatorship. But O'Brien pushes a lever on a dial, inflicting a massive pang of pain on Winston, and explicitly calls him stupid for believing that. O'Brien's answer is chilling because it strips away every single ideological mask in political history.
O'Brien says the party seeks power entirely for its own sake. We are not interested in the good of others. We are interested solely in power, pure power. He explains that power is not a means to an end. Power is the end. You do not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. You make the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship.
O'Brien explicitly points out that the party is different from the Nazis or the communists. He says those historical regimes were cowards and hypocrites because they pretended, or perhaps even believed, that they had seized power unwillingly and for a limited time, and that a paradise of human equality lay just around the corner. The inner party has no such illusions.
This is where Orwell explores the absolute terror of solipsism. O'Brien argues that reality exists nowhere except in the mind of the party. If the party says gravity doesn't exist, it doesn't. If the party says 2 + 2 = 5, then it does. But O'Brien asks a crucial philosophical question. How does one human being assert absolute power over another?
Winston answers, by making him suffer. And O'Brien agrees. Obedience is not enough. If a man is just obeying you, he might still have his own private thoughts. The only way to prove you have absolute power over a human mind is to tear it to pieces and put it back together in a shape of your own choosing. I want to read the exact quote O'Brien uses to describe the party's vision of the future because it is the darkest sentence Orwell ever wrote. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
The goal of 1984 isn't a twisted utopia. The goal is eternal, perfected sadism. Power for the sheer, unbroken thrill of inflicting pain and asserting dominance over reality itself.
That is the bleakest philosophical vision possible. But then we cross over to Brave New World, and the philosophy of power completely shifts. We sit in the comfortable, well-lit office of Mustafa Mond, the world controller, and we listen to his debate with John the Savage. Mond's philosophy of power couldn't be more different from O'Brien's.
Mustafa Mond is an incredibly compelling antagonist because he is, in many ways, an affable, highly rational dictator. He isn't a sadist. He is highly educated. He possesses locked safes full of banned books. He reads Shakespeare. He understands advanced physics, and he knows exactly what humanity has lost. But his core philosophy is that societal stability is the ultimate, undeniable good.
Mond explains the history of the world state. The world had gone through the horrific 9 Years' War. Humanity was on the brink of completely annihilating itself with anthrax bombs and economic collapse. Mond argues that to achieve survival and to guarantee happiness, humanity had to make a conscious trade.
And the trade was steep. They had to trade away high art, true empirical science, religion, and personal freedom. Mond freely admits that Shakespeare's Othello is vastly superior to the synthetic, mindless feelies that the state produces for entertainment. But he says you cannot have a lasting civilization without plenty of pleasant vices. High art requires tragedy, it requires social friction, it requires strong, unstable emotions.
Mond even brings up the Cyprus experiment, which I find fascinating. He tells the Savage that the state once tried to create an island populated entirely by alphas, the intellectual elite. They gave them all the resources they needed. And what happened? Within a few years, they had a civil war. No one wanted to do the menial labor, everyone was constantly arguing about philosophy and politics, and the society collapsed. Mond uses this to prove that you cannot have a stable society of free-thinking individuals. You need the genetically stunted epsilons to do the dirty work, and you need the conditioning to make everyone happy with their lot in life.
The price of universal happiness is the human soul. They sacrifice the peaks of human achievement, the great art, the scientific discoveries, the spiritual awakenings, to achieve a flat line of comfortable, unending mediocrity. And the Savage, who grew up on a reservation outside the world state and read Shakespeare, completely rejects this bargain.
The pushback from the Savage is incredible. He is sitting across from the most powerful man in the world, and he refuses the premise. He says, but I don't want comfort. I want God, I want poetry, I want real danger, I want freedom, I want goodness, I want sin. Mond looks at him and says, in fact, you're claiming the right to be unhappy. And the Savage says, all right then, I'm claiming the right to be unhappy.
It is a profound philosophical stand. In a world of mandatory, synthetic, chemically induced happiness, demanding the right to feel sorrow, to experience pain, to make terrible mistakes, is the ultimate proof of humanity. Huxley is arguing that our pain and our struggles are exactly what make us human.
And finally, we must look at the ultimate why of Gilead in The Handmaid's Tale. To understand the core philosophy of this regime, we have to look past Offred's narrative and examine the historical notes at the end of the novel.
The historical notes recontextualize the entire book. It is a transcript of an academic symposium taking place in the year 2195, long after Gilead has fallen. Professor Piasotto is giving a lecture on Offred's recorded takes, and what is brilliant about this section is the academic detachment. Piasotto urges his audience not to judge Gilead too harshly, to view it in its historical context.
Which is chilling in its own right, the sheer academic apathy toward past suffering. But Piasotto explains the conditions that allowed Gilead to rise. It didn't emerge in a vacuum, and it wasn't just a sudden burst of religious fanaticism. It was pitched as a pragmatic solution to a massive existential crisis.
The world was facing a severe demographic collapse. Birth rates were plummeting catastrophically due to environmental toxicity, nuclear accidents, a mutated strain of syphilis, and widespread use of birth control. The human race was literally aging out of existence.
Right. And the architects of Gilead, men like Commander Waterford and Commander Judd, used this genuine crisis to seize absolute power. They pitched their brutal regime as a necessary return to nature's norm, a way to forcefully save humanity from extinction. But the historical notes make it very clear. The specific methods they used to build their society were not original. It was a calculated synthesis of past historical atrocities.
Piasotto notes that Gilead's architects were pragmatic. They took the red uniforms from the history of WWII POW camps. They adopted the public salvagings from historical executions in the Philippines. They took the participation from ancient fertility rites. They studied history, found the mechanisms of control that worked best, and combined them into a new system.
And arguably their most sinister and effective structural innovation was the utilization of the aunts. The architects realized that if they used male guards to constantly police the women, it would breed unified resistance. Commander Judd realized that the most cost-effective and psychologically devastating way to control women was through other women.
By giving a specific group of older, infertile women, the aunts, a sliver of power, status, and the ability to inflict violence using cattle prods, they ensured the subjugation of the entire female population. They turned the victims into the enforcers of their own oppression, saving the regime massive military resources.
So the ultimate why of Gilead is survival, yes, but it was specifically the survival and absolute dominance of a patriarchal elite. They achieved it by synthesizing historical methods of oppression, utilizing religious hypocrisy as a shield, and turning the oppressed against each other. It's pragmatic, cynical, and terrifyingly plausible. It is the banality of evil applied to systemic societal engineering.
We have covered an immense amount of conceptual ground today. We have explored 3 absolute masterclasses in the architecture of tyranny. We looked closely at Orwell's 1984, where control is achieved through sensory deprivation, pain, terror, the systemic destruction of language, and the philosophical assertion that objective truth does not exist.
And we examine Huxley's Brave New World, where control is maintained through cellular genetic engineering, subconscious sleep teaching, chemical pacification, and the drowning of the soul in endless mandatory distraction.
And we analyzed Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, where control is built on biological reduction, the weaponization of the familiar domestic space, religious hypocrisy, and the structural brilliance of turning victims into complicit enforcers.
And this brings us back to the core mission of this deep dive. As a listener, you don't just absorb facts about old books, you apply these insights to the world you navigate every day. The authors of these texts weren't trying to predict the future with perfect accuracy. They were holding up funhouse mirrors to the specific anxieties of their own times. But the underlying mechanics of power they identified are timeless.
When you look at the landscape of the modern world, which of these architectural blueprints do you see manifesting? Do you see the creeping surveillance, the redirection of rage, and the linguistic distortion of 1984? Do you see the algorithmic, pleasure-driven, heavily medicated distractions, and the voluntary surrender of privacy found in Brave New World? Or do you see the rollback of bodily autonomy, the politicization of biology, and the creeping religious authoritarianism seen in The Handmaid's Tale?
That is the essential question you have to carry with you. But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. Something to mull over long after you finish listening to this discussion. We spent so much time arguing about which author got the future right. People are constantly debating online, are we living in Orwell's dystopia or Huxley's? Did Margaret Atwood perfectly predict our current political trajectory? But what if the ultimate perfected dystopia of the future doesn't limit itself to just one method? What if the most unbreakable, inescapable regime is one that figures out how to structurally combine all three?
A hybrid architecture of absolute control.
Imagine a cage that uses Atwood's manipulation of cultural familiarity to quietly install the system while we aren't looking, uses Huxley's engineered pleasure and algorithmic distraction to keep us happily pacified so we never question the locks on the doors, and keeps Orwell's brutal iron boot waiting patiently in the shadows for anyone who happens to wake up. That is the most terrifying blueprint of all. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep questioning the narratives presented to you, keep looking closely at the underlying blueprints of power in your own society, and hold fiercely onto your right to read, your right to think independently, and yes, as John the Savage demanded, even your right to be unhappy. Remember, sometimes the cage isn't made of iron. Sometimes it's just the world you're entirely used to, subtly painted over. Keep your eyes open.